sex is an acceleration of time and the temporal flow of evolution. So when we come to the mammalian formation of our sensorium, we have the catastrophe of the Cretaceous Jurassic extinction, when about somewhere between 70, 80, 86% of life is just wiped out. And the dinosaurs of Jurassic Park that we saw last summer, they're eliminated, and the little critters that are scurrying in the ferns and the underbrush get a chance to expand and to move into the new environment, just in the same way that the anaerobic bacteria in the previous catastrophe had to head for cover and go into the slime at the bottom of lakes or go as deep as they could possibly get. And the aerobic bacteria began to sort of take over the oceans and the atmosphere. When these forms of ecology are opened up, it provides a whole new act of reconceptualizing, or reconfiguring is a better word, reconfiguring the relationship of all these critters together. So what happens in the forest is our basic primate ancestry of Ramapithecus, the emphasis on olfaction, and the darkness of the forest, not as much emphasis on sight. So the kind of primordial archaic sensorium is the sensorium of olfaction. It's in the olfactory bulb in the brain under the limbic ring. It's the primordial sense of emotionality, that when we have sort of aromatherapy or various charismatic moments of the recovery of memory, it'll often be wed not to verbal conceptualized constructs, but to olfaction, which is why I wanted in the first lecture to begin with Proust's Madeleine and to show you the way in which the sight of the Madeleine doesn't trigger anything, but as soon as he smells and tastes it, and the crossing of two sense channels just explodes this enormously charismatic experience in which he's drawn back to the recovery of past time and an emotional relationship to his mother and his aunt and the feminine writ large. And indeed, as I said last time, the Madeleine itself, named after Mary Magdalene and in the form of a seashell, is the classical metaphor for the female genitalia. So that what's really being discovered in the primacy of olfaction is actually one's birth experience. And I would say, actually, in terms of, in your book, Rick, we're talking about Stan Groth's work on the birth trauma. I would again want to be heretical to say it isn't the agony of the compressive birth and the terror that actually the first act before we're even spanked and cry is cunnilingus. We kiss the vulva as we come out, so that the primordial experience is an erotic one of bonding of body to body. And I think this is precisely what Proust, in this ever so delicate French way, is trying to get at, is the birth of memory, the birth of consciousness, the recovery of lost time, the embeddedness of mind with the body of the mother, waiting for his mother to come and kiss him in bed, and that the quality of the erotic is here presented not in its terrifying, compressing way, but as a very erotic kind of affirmative form. But the important thing here is that for sexually charismatic experiences, and indeed in yoga, there are various times in Kriya Yoga where one of the stages of your practice is an excitation of the sensorium, where you recover this archaic function and you begin to smell auras rather than seeing them. You slip out of the sight-interpreted world, to use Rilke's phrase, and you begin to move into a world of primordial connectiveness, where olfaction carries this incredible charismatic epiphany. And so smelling auras is one of the cities that occurs in yogic practice. It's also equally true of schizophrenics, and so olfactory hallucinations are quite characteristic of people suffering from schizophrenia. So it's a very interesting phenomenon to study in terms of neuroscience. So I see in this evolution of the sensorium, the first cultural ecology is the forest, the archaic sensorium that Jean Gebser describes in his text that some of you are reading on Ever-Present Origin, is this olfactory auditory, and the kind of archetypal animal would be Ramapithecus. The next cultural ecology that occurs in this temporal flow of natural drift is weather change, desiccation, some kind of periodicity of the sun affecting the albedo and whatever, and then suddenly the trees are shrinking and the old environment now catastrophically is coming to an end, and the animals are being forced out into this expansive environment. So in Yeats's triangles, I see this kind of dynamic of kind of compression and consolidation and creative expansion into new space. the way Yeats described it in one of his letters is something like, all history seems to pulse between the crucifixion and the transfiguration on the mountain. So the crucifixion is fixing into time, and the transfiguration is connecting to the messianic history of Israel and a sort of cosmic vision. So the savanna is this expansive environment, and it brings forth in its natural drift a much more visual, auditory sense of bringing forth visual space rather than the darkness of the leaf canopy of the forest. There is now horizons of grass, the need to stand up to see over the grass, the need to acutely listen to try to target how far something is and how fast it's running and when it's likely to get you. So that this brings forth a very different kind of sensorium and sensibility, one that is much more haptic, involved in moving through space, picking up objects, the old familiar narratives of the opposable thumb, and the upright posture. So this all comes about because of a shift from forest to savanna. Another possible narrative, of course, is, and I guess you had a symposium here a while ago, on the wetland theory that we evolved, this coming from Alistair Hardy and popularized by Elaine Morgan, that the reason we don't have body hair and the women have floating breasts and we have salt tears and all of this is we actually evolved at the seashore, and all the hominids in the savanna just, were fried and died, and all the ones that stayed in the water, mermaid style, survived, and they're actually our ancestors. It's not the accepted theory, but there's a lot going for it, where there's some compelling aspects to the narrative. The next basic change, of course, is the pulse of the glaciations, and with the glacial environment, we again get this compressive environment. Suddenly, the human community, rather than expanding and wandering opportunistically and picking up rocks and pebble tools, suddenly the emphasis from temperature is on the skin. So you get this whole proprioceptive sense of emphasis on the edge and the skin and one's incarnation, and also the proprioceptive perception of the community itself. It begins to be formed, and so we have these glacial communities that are built out of mammoth tusks. I'm going to show you one in a second, and are built out of mammoth skulls and are covered with skins. And so the community, the body politic, the polis is covered with mammoth skin, and the individual is covered with skin, and the whole emphasis now is on this kind of proprioceptive notion in clothing. What occurs in this glacial compressive environment is the beginning of the first universal religion, the religion of the Great Mother, which is a religion whose iconography goes from Iberia to Siberia. So it is really a universal religion, and it's not just tribal localities. But it's also the creation by women of the first technology of pottery. We used to think that pottery was Neolithic. Now we know that pottery goes, ceramics, all the way back to Dolne Vestinice in 25,000 BC, and that these clay figurines of the goddess were mixed with water and dirt in such a way so that they would explode in the fire. So they seem to be some technology of divination. The archaeologists took a very patronizing approach to the value of this technology, and they said, how is it these people could miss the boat and they could create ceramics but not do anything valuable with it except these little trinkets of the great goddess and little art and divination? Why couldn't they have done something real, like build a weapon or something of this sort? And having taught with archaeologists at MIT and the universities in Toronto, I know that mentality that culture is defined by technology and nothing else is real. Religion isn't real, and art isn't real. So an aesthetic use of a technology is not valued. And the archaeologists went on to say, but this isn't the first case of primitive peoples missing the boat. After all, the Maya didn't have the wheel and just used it on toys. And so this whole notion of writing the narratives of prehistory in such a way that the scientific creation of botany and gathering and plant science, the creation of periodicity and observation of heavenly bodies and astrology, the creation of ceramics and religion and sculpture, all of these things are disvalued. That this creates a kind of narrative that reinforces the whole militaristic technological definition of culture. And so the first thing you have to do is to change your language and write your way out of those kind of forms. If you look at these progressions of these early cultural ecologies, the forest to the savanna to the glacial, I think you can use Gebser's ever-present origin and his evolutionary model of consciousness as a way of mapping that the archaic structure of consciousness would be shamanism, and that the woman at Dolne Vestinice, and I'll show you a picture of her in a minute, is actually an alchemist. And so that here is a role in which art and technology and ceramics and heat and chemistry are all being brought together as a process of divination and healing for the culture, so it's a shamanic alchemical function, and it's part of this general matrix of the universal religion of the Great Mother. So the archaic structure of consciousness would be shamanic and would be like Dolne Vestinice in Moravia and the Ukraine in 25,000 BC. The magical structure would be Çatalhöyük in 6500 BC and moving up to more of rituals and perhaps sacrifice. The mythic structure would be the rise of civilization and literacy and would be ancient Sumer and Mesopotamia. So now one thing about Gebser, those of you who are reading him, sometimes he's mistranslated into English where it's called stages of consciousness. And in German it's Bewusstwerdung and Wendung. And so the words in German are actually process words. They mean transformation and turning. They don't mean static stages. And so it's too easy for us to dismiss Gebser and say, oh, he's just another white male Eurocentric guy who's writing this linear progressive theory of the evolution of consciousness from archaic, magical, mythical, mental, and integral at the end. The phrase for this institute, integral, actually is one that was used by Gebser in the 40s. So I think that's unfair to him, that actually what he's trying to understand are structures of consciousness, organizations of the sensorium, and their unfoldment, Entfaltung, their unfoldment through time. So it's a very dynamic, process-oriented narrative, and I think it has a very compelling narrative power to it, perhaps because he too is very much interested in bringing science and art together. He hung out with Heisenberg and von Weizsäcker, not the president, but the physicist Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker. But he also was friends with Picasso, and Lorca, before he was executed, brought him some of his drawings, and he was friends with Lorca. He was in Spain before the Spanish Civil War. He was friends with Malraux as well in Paris, and then escaped the Nazis, even though he was German and Prussian. He was not in Germany during the war and managed to get across the border into Switzerland. It's with that in mind that I sort of recommended for this course here on the evolution of consciousness that we take a look at Gebser. Now I'd like to show you some of these slides I've been referring to. This is a drawing of Dolne Vestinice, which is in the Czech Republic in Moravia, and it's about 26,000, so this is a glacial settlement, surrounded by these mammoth tusks that created the perimeter of the fence, and then these huts that oftentimes were built out of the heads of mammoths, used as the kind of lattice work, and then the skin was stretched over it. So here's a very crisp definition of the sort of first proto-settlement. The woman, who you'll see in a minute, was actually, her burial was outside the settlement, which brings up all kinds of interesting notions of the creative role of the shaman as the wounded healer, the person who is outside, who serves the inside by being outside, by having a certain amount of kind of magical distance. The next slide, please. These are all artifacts, and you see this kind of stylized figure in which the Great Mother up here in figure 1 is sort of both penis and testicles and breasts, and it's a kind of a dimorphic compression of the relationship of the male and the female together. And then here's the traditional statue with no face and no mouth with just the eyes. There's a lot in Gebser about the no mouth. But here, violating all the usual stylized cliches about the origins of art and sculpture and the rest of it, here is the world's first portraiture. This is not just a stylized Great Mother. This is a figure of a woman carved in ivory with a very distorted jaw, whether from acromegalia or traumatic injury. But the face is twisted. And she has this bun, which of course is in many different cultures is a symbol of kind of spiritual power and energy and the top crown chakra. And so whether it's Buddha or whatever, here it goes back to 25,000 BC with her. But this is a specific woman, and her body was found outside in the burial. So she presumably is this person who had such kind of